Thank you so much, Jimmy, and thank you. I wish I had heard your presentation before I did this one, because I would have changed some things. But can everybody hear me? I don't project real well. Okay. All right. My husband Toby and I have been grazing at Dogwood Farm for the past 42 years. And he has been raising Herefords since he was a boy of 13 in 1964. So this has been going on for a long time. We've had time to make every mistake in the book, folks, and we've just about done it. Well, where is Dogwood Farm? Of the 120 counties in Kentucky, we are the farthest northwest. This is Ballard Wildlife Management Area right here, and that is about 4 miles west of our farm. We're right here at this little star. So 4 miles or 5 miles to the north is Illinois, and 4 miles to the west, 4 or 5 miles to the west is Illinois. And we can see Illinois from our pastures because it has hills and we don't. It's low altitude. I didn't mention that. Low altitude means high humidity. So we're extremely high humidity, and I want to show you the surrounding land. This is the land that is surrounding us. Our farm is, let's see if I can get this pointer to go. All right, oops, what am I doing here? I got to get back. All right. The farms that are outlined in red there are ours. This one right here is the one that I initially started grazing, and this one right here is the one where we live. And this one right here, we've been renting for 42 years. This one right here is called the Christian Place, and we just brought it into pasture production in 2015. So what we're doing is trying to convert row crop land back to pasture. Most people nowadays are doing the opposite. They're taking pasture land, converting it to row crop land. They're going the opposite direction. And it's very, very difficult to turn row crop land that's been farmed for 30, 40, 50, 60 years or more, even 70, back to pasture. Why is that? Well, because the way we row crop these days kills the microbes in the soil. And the microbes in the soil are so important to us. I was really glad to hear Chris mention them. We don't see them. It's the hidden half of nature that we have to try to pay attention to now, the things that we can't see. And when we walk across the surface, we don't see those things. Toby's grandfather put this farm together in the early part of the 20th century, and in the 1930s, he lost it during the Dust Bowl and the Depression. And Toby's father had to go to Michigan to work in factories and earn the money to buy that farm back. So it's hard-earned land. And we don't want to waste it. We don't want to mistreat it. We want to take good care of it. The part of the farm that I worked with was this tiny little section right here. We call it the 12-acre field. And in 1989, that's when I first started trying management intensive grazing. I fenced that into 10 sections, and I put 25 heifers on it and ran them all summer, grazing a day or two or three at a time. And it had been it had been like a great big alleyway full of weeds and just overgrazed. There was spurge there. It had in the past been good pasture, but it was worn out. And by doing that to it, by the end of that summer, the fescue had returned. There was clover. It was green. And Toby said, "Oh, maybe we ought to be doing more of this." So he's always said, "Well, I was born in Illinois and raised in Kentucky, but I'm really from Missouri because you have to show me. And I showed him, and he understood what Alan Savory was talking about back in 1989. So let's look at what was before about 1970. There were mostly small farms, 40 to 250 acres. Many trees, fence rows, woodlots, shades, ponds for cattle. Many landowners lived and worked on the farm. There was diversified production. Toby's grandfather raised strawberries and had fruit trees. There were many small dairies. Almost everyone in our neighborhood back in the 70s had a dairy. There were more beef cows. There was more pasture, more green. There was cash crop, barley, tobacco. Of course, everyone did that. I don't think that's a great loss except for the work. I didn't much like tobacco. There were many young people in rural areas looking for work at that time. Now there's much erosion. You can see it in a lot of these fields, like people that, well, all right, like right in here. Some of them are sown down waterways. Some are just eroded gullies, but there's more brown than green. Very large fields and farms, wide open spaces, very few trees for windbreaks or shade for cattle. There are lots of absentee owners. The owner of the farm that we have rented for 42 years has not visited in 11 years. There are many row crops, corn, wheat, and soybeans grown on shares or leased. There's only one dairy left in our county. We had a feed mill back in the 1980s, and during that time, we had 18 dairies in the county. Now there's one. And it's also the only one in the Jackson Purchase, unless there's still one at Murray, but I don't think there is. There's very little tobacco. There's some hay, a few farms with beef cattle, fewer young people every year, smaller communities, more people in urban areas. Okay, for us, there are 4 steps to better grazing. You observe, you remember, you respond, and you adapt. What you observe is the cattle condition, forage conditions, soil and topography, weather restrictions, drought or flood, last grazing time. You remember that. You remember the previous year's grazing. You remember the history of the land use. And you remember former problems. And then you keep records. I like to keep records with a camera. But this year, all my records got lost. I had 15,000 pictures, and I lost my camera. You respond by improving forage quality and quantity. You reduce the time on each paddock. You increase rest periods, and you have emergency seasonal plans. You adapt by having season-to-season succession plantings, and that's extremely important for us. We use a lot of succession plantings. You change the order of grazing year to year, alter the stock density, reroute traffic patterns, and change the type or the age of your stock. All of those things are adaptations that we can make. Stocking rate increased year by year as our pasture management improved. In 1977, we were set stocking, and we had just we'd calve out on one pasture in the spring, we'd move them somewhere else for the summer, we'd move them somewhere else for the fall, and then we'd move them back for the winter. There were 30 cows on 90 acres. In '89, following a decade of drought, that was when my first experiment with the Savory system, or management intensive grazing, began. And Toby returned to full-time teaching that year, so I was left on the farm pretty much by myself to figure this out. And he was an excellent teacher. It would have been a huge loss to all his students if he had not been able to teach. He was born to teach. Me, I didn't feel that call. And then in 1990, our herd produced 49 calves on the same acreage. In 1995, they increased to about 79 on about the same acreage as 1980. In 1997, making more and more little paddocks, eventually more than doubled our stocking rate. We began expanding our grazing systems to the English place, and the herd produced 98 calves with the addition of about 20 acres of formerly unfenced land on the English place. I drove a lot of T-posts by hand and put up a lot of single wire fences. 1999 was also a drought year. All natural grass-fed Hereford beef changed our farm and our lives. In 1999, after the loss of three of our four parents and the retirement of our hired hand, a year of major drought, we sold about 30 cows. We hosted the Heartland Forage Field Day that summer, emphasizing summer forages. 2002 was our first and last public auction of registered Hereford breeding stock. We decided private treaty was more our style. And breeding stock began selling better after that. We sold cattle into 25 states. Our son's severe colitis coincided with our first sales of custom grass-fed beef and USDA inspected ground beef. This changed both our farm's focus and our target market. And then in 2012, we had a total of 307 cows by then, calves, steers, and breeding age bulls on 190 acres. That was risky. That's too many. Wouldn't recommend that you try this at home. Major drought that year. We had 30 grass-raised cows that sold to MM Ranch in Kansas that year, so that was a big help. And we learned more about adapting the herd size in case of drought. All right, this is the English place. You can see here, our house is right in this area. This is what we call the Christian place back here, named after Toby's cousin Jesse Christian. And the English place is named after a widow named Lillian English, who had that up until the 1970s. In all of that time, while she owned it, it was row cropped, except for this little area right back in here, which was in tall fescue. And even this part right here was also row cropped. And you can see this was taken in 2008. This is a Google picture. And in 2008, you can see that there's still a lot more brown than green. This is the toy place that we rent. And this is the area where we had our field day last summer. It was planted to summer annuals. And thank you, Mr. Raymer, for helping provide some of the seed for that. All right. This is called, like I said, the English place, and grazing on the English place. One farm with many small paddocks means less time grazed, more time resting and regrowing. But at this time, in 2008, all of this, the English place, all of the Christian place, Mr. Harris's farm, all of that was row cropped. The Cooper farm is row cropped. Earl Toy's place is row cropped. So we had to take it in just a little field at a time. The results after that, this is the next spring. We had a drought in 2007, and all of that land that's here, that you see in this area right here, had been planted in soybeans in 2007. They never got to higher than knee high. Normally we would make 60, 65 bushels per acre of soybeans. That year they wouldn't have made 10. So we baled it. and that, of course, we didn't make any hay that year either. So the soybeans saved our cow herd, basically, and allowed us to change our minds. And when Toby planted ryegrass on that soybean field, this was the result in spring of 2008. So we had happy cows and fat calves even after that awful year. We had renewed soil with organic matter. We had erosion control. We had more green and less brown. We had the promise of some saved earth, but not yet. What happened? Erosion. That's what changed our minds. That's what that field looked like in the spring of 2011. Row crop land after flash floods looks like that. We were able to repair and control it by planting perennial pasture on it. Normally, when we start renovating a pasture, we'll put in some summer annuals first to help build mass, biomass, and organic matter. This year, we skipped that step and probably shouldn't have because this was in September 16th of 2012. You remember 2012 was probably the worst drought in our history. And the alfalfa there did well. The grasses didn't do so well. They did not survive very well during that drought. And this field didn't grow very well until we got a hurricane rain on it around the end of August, early September. And then it came on and turned green and it was beautiful. The alfalfa responded beautifully because it had taproots. That young grass didn't survive because it didn't have taproots. And there were no microbes to help it. There were not enough earthworms and that sort of thing to help it. Changing from annual row crops to the year-round grazing of forage-finished beef has greatly improved our per-acre profitability. It's greatly reduced our overhead costs, much less machinery expense and repair costs. We sold our combine, we sold our planters. No expensive toxic chemicals are needed. No extra fertilizers needed. And when you're selling all natural beef, you have to sell it to the people who want all natural food, which means we don't use any artificial fertilizers. We use only what the customers want, which is natural. Vastly improved soil quality meant wider diversity of forages. Managed grazing regenerates the soil organic matter. There are more earthworms, tumblebugs, beneficial soil microbes, better tilth, and moisture retention. There's better erosion control. Hooray! In our part of the woods, when we have a flood, it's a real flood because we're such low altitude. Waterways are always sown down and protected with perennial pastures. The soils are covered year-round. The cattle are fenced away from fragile riparian zones where it's washed. So, changing our minds so that there's less brown means changing our actions so that there's more green. Season to season, year after year, diversity is the key to adaptability. The plants and the animals, for them, adaptability is natural. They do it. They have to do it because they live out there in the weather. They live in conditions like this day to day. They live in the moment. They don't plan ahead the way we do. We have to plan ahead for them. So what is it that is the key to human adaptability? Changing our minds and changing our actions. Cover crops fill the cold season grazing gaps for us. We plant things late winter and early spring forage cover crops like cereal rye, ryegrass, winter peas, radishes, crimson clover. All those things can fill in. We use them on row crop land or fields in transition to pasture, and we overseed some of our permanent pastures with them sometimes. Calving in sync with nature helps to optimize forage availability. We never calve in the winter. For us, the best calving times are after the spring equinox or after the fall equinox. We arrange the calving and breeding times to fit the time of year when the grazable forage is at its best for quality, for quantity, for digestibility. And of course, summer breeding can be a big problem where there's toxic fescue as the dominant forage. We don't have very many acres of toxic fescue, but we use a lot of warm season forages. Fall breeding is a better option when toxicity is lower for us. And if we could choose a perfect time to calve, it would be probably the month after the fall equinox. That would be our choice for calving. It also means usually having smaller calves because the winter usually causes calves to be larger, and then you have more calving problems with your heifers. For May, June grazing and creek grazing, of course, the main problem is staying ahead of the spring flush of growth, but our calves love creek grazing ahead of the cows. In Kentucky, quality summer forage can be a huge challenge. Succession planting works for us. There's Toby baling some hay, and this was probably in August or September. And it was a mix of Lespedeza, red clover, and quick and big crabgrass, which is a selected crabgrass from Oklahoma, and it's wonderful stuff in the summertime. Some summer forages can be broadcast in the winter for frost seeding or late or early spring to be trampled in, or they can be harrowed in with a chain link harrow, and all of these work well for that. Lespedeza, red clover, white clover, and crabgrasses like quick and big, that's our go-to for the summertime. And we can sow these on top of fescue to do what Chris was talking about, a summer stockpile. It works. And the crabgrass doesn't really shade out that fescue. Finishing cattle on forages only without grain requires some high-quality forage nearly year-round. Here you see this is wheat with some turnips drilled into it. It gives those steers a little boost and helps them really pack on some weight and add some fat. Forages for fall and winter grazing like ryegrasses and kale and turnips can be drilled in July and August and September in pastures that have been grazed close during the summertime. And there's a stand of kale, and it's some wonderful stuff. Kale will last for a lot of the year. This is a variety called Winfred that comes from New Zealand. Winter grazing for all. Here's January 4th. That's some cool season grasses that we had planted in the fall or late summer. They're good for developing yearlings, both bulls and heifers. January 5th, there's a steer munching on a turnip. They really enjoy sweet turnips, and they help them finish faster in the cold weather months. There's some cows with calves grazing ryegrass. You can see that line. That's just the difference between where the ryegrass is tall and where they've already grazed it. There's not a fence there. They were just turned in on that. That was on January 20th. That winter, we grazed 30 cows on about 15 acres of ryegrass, and I put out 7 bales of hay. That's all for those 30 cows between January and April. Ryegrass keeps the soil warm and makes a good breeding pasture for fall calving cows. Our major investment's been good seed. We use mixes of perennial cool season forages, about 30% of legumes. We plant some red clover every year. We plant white and ladina clovers when it seems like the pastures are getting a little thin on those, although they persist better than red clover. We plant a few grazing type alfalfas in with our cool season grasses. 70% grasses like fescue, preferably endophyte free or friendly endophyte. We've had really good luck with a variety that's called Tower Protect, and this year we're trying one called Martin Protect, Martin 2. Orchard grass, timothy, perennial ryegrass, bluegrass, and others. We plant some of those whenever we're renovating. Okay, our priorities and our goals are to produce healthy, gentle Herefords, preferably trouble-free. They aren't always, but if they aren't, we don't sell them as breeding stock. Working to harvest forages to produce quality beef, and to improve the soil. That is really our main goal right now, to improve the soil year-round for future generations. That's our grandson, River, who's now 10. We have one 7. We have another grandson who's 2, and we have a granddaughter who's 5. And we're hoping that if they have to depend on this farm for their living someday, the soil will be good enough that they can make a good living in it. It won't be worn out farmland. Since 2014, mentoring has also been a goal for us. This is Toby with a friend of ours named Justin Adams, who lives near Princeton. And he's been our best protege, I suppose. There aren't enough young people who have resources to become cattle producers. Justin did not grow up on a farm. His parents do not own a farm. But that's what he's always wanted to do. So we're going to try to help him if we can. Even with access to land, young cattlemen need help working with their livestock. Our long experience with forage and cattle is something we like to share. And so we have tried to help 6 younger cattlemen so far get started by using our cattle. 2 of them have completely given up. 2 of them are still trying, and 2 of them are on the fence. So I guess that's working pretty well. So we hope you can join us someday for a field day or a pasture walk. If you want to come tomorrow, we'll find some food for you. And we want to feature all-season grazing on our pasture walks and our farm. If you come tomorrow, you won't see anything real spectacular because a lot of the forages after the drought are this tall, but they are up. So we want more green and less brown. Any questions?
Questions for Debbie. What's the height on that crabgrass you talked about?
Quick and big? Well, Greg Brand has seen it. It will get up this tall sometimes. Yes, it can be cut for hay. And it will reseed itself. If you let it go to seed, it's still palatable. And especially if you've got some legumes in with it, it makes a very good forage. And it does not shade out fescue the way some other things will. We have also grazed some Johnson grass because whenever you have planted corn, you get free Johnson grass. It just comes with the territory. And this summer, we stockpiled some summer forages like Chris was talking about. There was no fescue in there, but there was Johnson grass, there was crabgrass, there was lespedeza that we had sown, there was red clover, and it made a really fine pasture during the drought in August and September.
Another question, John.
We don't use any chemicals, no herbicides, no artificial fertilizer. We no-till. Everything's no-till. Toby uses an old John Deere planter that he bought used from his cousin. Yes, it's a grain drill. We have looked at getting some pasture-type drills, but if we get rain, that usually does well. And then I broadcast seed every spring too, usually for frost seeding. Well, I don't. The cows eat the weeds. We have a lot of weeds that our cows will eat that most cows won't because they've been taught to eat. And if you were here a year or two ago, Kathy Both was here talking about how how you can teach your cows to eat weeds. We also put up with some ugliness, you know, for a while.
The question was, if you don't use herbicides, how do you control weeds?
Yeah.
Sorry. Good. Another one? Are you good?
Yes. Well, to just comment on the weed. The weed is just a plant in the wrong place.
Right.
It's excellent feed.
Yes, spiny amaranth even. Our cows will eat the tops out of spiny amaranth.
The best weed control of all is a tight, fertilized pasture.
Yeah.
And there you have it. All right. Yes, Susan.
So what changes will you need to make in a drought when you've had a drought in the fall like this?
So what changes will you need to make when you've had a drought in the fall like this?
Well, what we did was plant seed on faith. And of course it is raining now, so things have come up. They're not as big as we'd like to see them, but we just keep planting good seed. Eventually some of it will come up, even if it's not a good year. We'll have enough forage, yes.